At my daughter's wedding, my son-in-law thought he was clever. With a smirk on his face, he introduced me to his boss as nothing more than an old loser. The room laughed, and he felt victorious, convinced I was just a worn-out man with nothing to my name. What he didn't know was that I wasn't just some retiree sitting quietly in the corner. I was the man who had built the very company that gave him his career. And before the night was over, his arrogance would collapse in front of everyone he tried to impress. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far our stories reach around the world. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with friends who love a good dramatic twist. Your support helps us bring even more powerful stories to life. I still remember the first evening I invited Ethan, my daughter Clara's, into my home. Clara had insisted I meet him properly, saying he was ambitious, polished, and full of plans for the future. She looked at him with such admiration that I held back my reservations. After all, every father wants his daughter to be happy. Ethan arrived in a tailored suit that seemed almost too sharp for a casual dinner at my modest house. His handshake was firm, but his eyes scanned my living room, as though he were appraising property he had no intention of buying. Clara didn't notice. She was glowing, happy, hopeful. I tried to focus on that. But then Ethan spoke. "Cozy place," he said, glancing at the old bookshelf that held decades of my life. Photos of Clara's childhood, my late wife's favorite novels, awards from a career I never felt the need to boast about. His tone wasn't appreciative. It was dismissive. "I guess it makes sense, since you've been retired for so long." Clara nudged him gently, whispering something under her breath. But Ethan only smirked, leaning back in his chair, as though my home were beneath him. I stayed calm. Years of business negotiations had taught me the value of silence. But inside, a flicker of unease grew. Was this the man my daughter would marry? A man who measured worth by square footage and car brands? As dinner went on, Ethan spoke at length about his position at Stratacore Systems, the company he proudly called the future of innovation. I listened, quietly sipping tea, noting the irony. If only he knew. When dessert was served, Clara excused herself to fetch something from the kitchen. That's when Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Clara tells me you've been out of the game for a while," he said. "No offense, but this generation is different. Connections, money, status. That's what matters now. You might not get it, but I'll make sure Clara never has to live small again." He said it with confidence, as though I were an obstacle, not a father. I smiled politely, though inside I felt a tightening in my chest, not from hurt, but from recognition. I had met men like Ethan before. Young, arrogant, quick to dismiss what they couldn't see or understand. They thought the world owed them respect because of titles or paychecks. What they never realized was that respect isn't granted by appearances. It's earned, tested, and proven over time. Clara returned just then, carrying a tray of cookies she had baked. Her laughter filled the room, easing the tension Ethan had created. For her sake, I said nothing, but I knew then, my daughter was walking into a marriage with a man who valued her father less than he valued his own reflection. A week later, Clara called with excitement in her voice. "Dad," she said, "Ethan's boss is coming to the wedding. He wants to introduce you too." Isn't that amazing? I felt the irony pierce deeper. She didn't know the truth. That Ethan's boss and I had once built Stratacore together, long before Ethan even knew how to tie a tie. We had been partners, innovators, dreamers, and though I had stepped away years ago, my legacy still lived within the company Ethan treated like his kingdom. I didn't correct her. I simply said, "That's wonderful, Clara, I look forward to it." But that night, as I sat at my desk, I pulled out an old mahogany box. Inside were cufflinks engraved with the original Stratacore emblem, a design I had sketched myself decades earlier. They were a reminder of where it all began, of the late nights and relentless work that built the empire Ethan now boasted about. I polished them carefully, holding them up to the light. They would be my silent companion at the wedding. Not a weapon, not a boast, just a truth, waiting for the right moment to surface. The rehearsal dinner came, held at a fine restaurant Ethan had chosen. He wanted elegance, prestige, photographs worthy of his social media feed. Clara looked radiant in her simple dress, her joy untouched by the undercurrents swirling beneath the evening. Ethan, however, was in his element. Surrounded by colleagues and family, he commanded attention with stories of his achievements, his promotions, his future plans. Every so often, his words carried barbs directed at me. "My father-in-law here," he announced at one point, raising his glass of sparkling water, "is enjoying the quiet life now. Nothing wrong with that. Of course, some people are just meant for simpler things." The table chuckled politely. Clara shifted uncomfortably, but Ethan pressed on, oblivious to her discomfort. I remained composed, answering with patience, never once lowering myself to his level. Inside, though, I felt the quiet strength of a storm waiting for its moment. Because I knew something Ethan didn't. I knew that at the wedding, when he paraded me before his boss with that same smug smile, the truth would unravel every illusion he clung to, and I wouldn't have to say a word. That night, as I walked home under the quiet sky, Clara called out, "Dad, are you okay? He's just nervous, that's all. He doesn't mean to sound so harsh." I smiled and kissed her forehead. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. Focus on your happiness. That's all I want." She hugged me tightly, and for her sake, I kept the truth hidden a little longer. But deep down, I knew Ethan's arrogance would collapse under the weight of reality soon enough. And when it did, the entire room would see him for what he truly was. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, sunlight glinting off the Chicago skyline. For Clara, it was the happiest day of her life. For Ethan, it was the stage on which he planned to parade his triumphs. A beautiful bride on his arm, powerful colleagues in attendance, and his future unfolding exactly as he imagined. For me, it was the day the truth would finally step into the light. I rose early, my suit pressed and ready, my shoes polished until they reflected the morning sun. On the desk beside me lay the cufflinks platinum, engraved with the original Stratacore emblem. I fastened them slowly, deliberately, as though preparing for the most important meeting of my life. In many ways, Clara called me around mid-morning, her voice full of nervous joy. "Dad, are you on your way? Ethan wants to make sure you're there early to meet everyone." "I'll be there," I assured her gently. "Don't worry about me. Today is your day." I arrived at the Drake Hotel just after noon. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a vision of elegance. White flowers and golden drapery adorning every corner. Guests in fine suits and dresses mingled, their conversations a mixture of family chatter and corporate networking. Near the front of the chapel, I spotted Walter Kane, Stratacore's CEO and my old friend. His silver hair was neatly combed, his navy suit sharp, his posture commanding as ever. He scanned the crowd with polite interest, no doubt looking forward to meeting his protégé's new family. He didn't notice me at first. To him, I was just another guest. And for now, that was exactly how I wanted it. Then Ethan emerged from a side room resplendent in his tailored tuxedo, confidence radiating like a second skin. He shook hands, clapped shoulders, and greeted colleagues with the assurance of a man convinced he had the world in his pocket. When his eyes met mine, I saw the faintest shadow of our earlier conversations flicker across his face, but he quickly masked it with a grin. "Mr. Wood," he said warmly, too loudly, "glad you could make it after our little discussion the other night." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly. "This promises to be unforgettable." He laughed, but the sound rang a little hollow. Then he turned back to his guests, basking in their admiration. The ceremony began soon after. I walked Clara down the aisle, her hand tucked into mine, her dress a vision of grace. For a moment, the entire plan, the humiliation, the reckoning, faded into the background. All I saw was my daughter, radiant and trembling, beginning a new chapter in her life. "You look beautiful," I whispered as we stepped forward together. "Thank you, Dad," she murmured, her eyes glistening. At the altar, I placed her hand gently into Ethan's. For just a heartbeat, we stood, as a family, bride, groom, father, beneath the watchful gaze of every guest. The officiant spoke. Vows were exchanged, and rings slipped into place. Ethan delivered his lines with polished sincerity, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Clara as though nothing could shake him. Clara's words, however, carried a warmth that eclipsed everything else. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause. Ethan kissed Clara with triumphant pride, casting a quick glance toward Walter, ensuring his mentor had witnessed every moment. The receiving line formed, guests congratulating the couple, laughter and smiles filling the air. Ethan was glowing, introducing Clara to his colleagues, savoring every handshake, every compliment. And then, I saw Walter approaching, making his way through the line with dignified composure. Ethan straightened his posture, his chest puffing slightly. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Mr. Kane," Ethan said proudly, his voice carrying over the chatter, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Clara, and her father." He gestured toward me with casual dismissal, as if presenting a minor character in the grand story of his life. "This is Mr. Wood. He's retired now, living modestly. But hey, he's family." The words hung in the air, light as a feather and sharp as a blade. I saw the polite smiles of nearby colleagues, the way they leaned in, expecting Ethan to shine. But then Walter's eyes shifted. He looked at me, really looked, and the recognition came like a spark. His gaze dropped to my cufflinks, glinting under the chandelier light, the emblem of Stratacore, designed in a cramped basement office decades ago. Walter froze, then his face broke into astonished disbelief. "Good Lord, Porter!" The chatter around us died instantly. Heads turned, conversations halted, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan blinked, confused. "You know him." "Know him?" Walter's voice rose with incredulity. "Ethan, this is Porter Wood. My partner, the man who built Stratacore with me from the ground up." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan's confident mask shattered, his expression collapsing into raw panic. His mouth opened, but no words came. Around us, colleagues stared in stunned silence, processing the revelation. The father-in-law Ethan had mocked, dismissed, and paraded as a nobody was, in fact, the co-founder of the empire that signed his paychecks. Walter turned on him, his voice sharp as steel. "Ethan, what exactly have you been saying to my partner these past few months?" Ethan stammered, color draining from his face. I didn't know. He never told me. "I thought you thought wrong," Walter snapped. And in this business, arrogance built on ignorance is a dangerous combination. The silence that followed was heavy. Every guest hanging on the unraveling spectacle. Ethan stood frozen, his future trembling on the edge of collapse, as the truth he had ignored finally bore down on him with merciless clarity. And I remained calm. Because this was only the beginning. The silence after Walter's words stretched across the ballroom like a drawn bowstring. Guests who had moments earlier been sipping tea and chatting now leaned in, their eyes fixed on Ethan, watching him squirm under the weight of revelation. My daughter Clara's hand trembled in mine. She looked at me with wide, searching eyes. "Dad, is that true?" I nodded softly, never breaking my gaze from Ethan. "Yes, sweetheart, I helped build Stretacor long before Ethan even stepped through its doors." Clara's breath caught, her face paling as she looked back at her new husband. You knew." Ethan shook his head wildly. "No, Clara, I swear, I didn't know. He never said anything. How was I supposed to?" Walter cut him off, his tone sharper than I had heard in years. "How were you supposed to know? Ethan, every man in this room knows the story of Stretacor Porter and I were there in the trenches, 20-hour days, eating cold takeout on the office floor while we built the foundation of everything you brag about. And yet you stood here, introducing him as some nobody." The word echoed like a gavel strike. Ethan's mouth opened and closed, his carefully rehearsed confidence gone. For once, there were no clever lines, no smug little smiles, only desperation. "Mr. Kane, please." Walter's hand cut through the air, silencing him. "Save it. I have no patience for arrogance that masks ignorance. Do you know what makes a leader, Ethan? It isn't sharp suits or inflated stories, it's respect. Respect for people, for sacrifice, for history. And you've shown none of it." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Colleagues exchanged glances. Ethan's boss, the man he idolized, had just dismantled him in front of everyone. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. "Ethan, how could you talk to my father the way you did? Dismissing him, belittling him. You told me he should stay in his lane." Her voice cracked, and all along, he was the very man who gave you the lane to walk on. Ethan reached for her hand, panic in his eyes. "Clara, please, I didn't mean." I just thought. She pulled back, her expression torn between anger and heartbreak. I let the silence linger. My instinct as a father was to shield her, but she needed to see Ethan's true character laid bare. Walter turned to me then, his voice softer. "Porter, you should have told us you'd be here today. We would have honored you properly." I shook my head. "No, Walter. Today isn't about me. It's about Clara. She deserves her moment. My legacy doesn't need a spotlight." Ethan flinched at the word legacy. Walter studied me for a long moment, then nodded in respect. He turned back to Ethan, his expression hardening again. "You'd do well to learn from him. Humility, Ethan, is worth more than every promotion you'll ever chase." The weight of the words pressed down on him like stone. Around us, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers rippled, eyes darted, and Ethan's colleagues began to reevaluate the man they thought they knew. But Ethan, desperate not to lose control of his carefully constructed image, grasped for one last lifeline. "Mr. Kane, I can explain, if you just give me a chance." Walter's voice thundered through the room. "Enough. You've already had your chance. And you squandered it the moment you chose arrogance over respect." The finality in his tone was devastating. Ethan's face drained of color. Clara turned back to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, what do you think I should do?" Every eye swung toward me. The father, who had been silent, patient, dismissed, now stood at the center of the storm. I stepped closer, my voice steady, deliberate. "Sweetheart, marriage is built on trust, respect, honor. A man who cannot respect your father cannot respect you. If he is so quick to belittle the people who matter most, imagine what life will look like years down the road. His arrogance will consume everything in its path." Ethan's face contorted. "That's not fair. You're twisting this." I raised a hand, silencing him without raising my voice. "No, Ethan, fairness is something you never granted me. From the first dinner in my home, you looked down on me because you saw only what was in front of your eyes. An aging man in a modest house, you never bothered to ask what stories lived behind the walls, what sacrifices shaped the life you mocked. You wanted status, but status without character is nothing but smoke." The crowd was still. Ethan's shoulders slumped under the weight of my words, his fight draining away. Clara took a step back from him, her eyes full of sorrow. "I thought I knew you, but I don't think I do." For a moment, Ethan reached out again, but she turned and walked toward me instead. The distance between them, bride and groom, became a chasm. Walter cleared his throat, his voice final. Ethan, we'll be speaking about your position at Stratacore on Monday. Consider this your warning. You have a choice to make. Humble yourself and change, or lose everything you've built. The murmurs that followed were damning. Ethan had wanted to rise higher that night. Instead, he had fallen farther than he ever imagined. I placed an arm around Clara's shoulders, steadying her as she leaned into me. My words were quiet, but they carried through the silence. This was never about revenge. It was about truth. And sometimes, the truth is the only mirror a man needs. The music struck up faintly again, the guests slowly returning to their seats, but the air never regained its lightness. The celebration had shifted. The bride still radiant, but the groom exposed for what he was. As I led Clara away from the crowd for a moment of peace, I knew one thing with certainty. Ethan's empire of arrogance had crumbled, and from its ashes, Clara would see clearly who he really was. And that was enough. The wedding reception unfolded under a strange tension. Music played, waiters carried trays of hors d'oeuvres. Guests tried to resume light-hearted chatter, but the shadow of what had just happened lingered over every corner of the ballroom. Clara sat beside me, her face pale but composed. She had put on a brave smile for the photos, but I knew her heart was in turmoil. Her husband, the man she had defended, admired, and trusted, had been unmasked before her very eyes. Ethan, meanwhile, drifted through the room like a ghost. Gone was the confident stride, the booming voice, the ever-ready grin. He avoided eye contact with colleagues. His attempts at conversation met with stiff nods and clipped replies. The same people who had laughed at his stories only an hour earlier now whispered behind their glasses, trading sidelong glances that cut deeper than words. At one point, I overheard a senior manager mutter to another, "If he didn't even recognize Porterwood, what else has he been blind to?" The remark wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was dismissive. The exact fate Ethan had once reserved for me. Clara leaned closer, her voice trembling. "Dad, what do I do now?" I looked at her. My daughter, my only child, still in her wedding gown, standing at the edge of a life-changing decision. My heart ached for her. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "you don't have to decide everything tonight, but you do need to open your eyes. Love can forgive flaws, but it cannot survive on lies and arrogance. Ask yourself, do you see a partner here, or do you see a man you'll spend your life apologizing for?" Her lips pressed together, eyes glistening. "I don't know if I can forgive the way he treated you. That's not for me to decide," I told her. "Only you can answer that. But remember, a marriage is not about saving face, it's about building a life, and you deserve one built on respect." Before she could reply, Ethan appeared at our table. His tie was loosened, his confidence in tatters. "Clara," he began, voice low and urgent, "please, can we talk? Just us." Clara stiffened, but she nodded. "Fine, 5 minutes." They stepped aside to a quiet corner. I stayed seated, watching as Ethan gestured wildly, his hands trembling as he spoke. Clara listened, her arms folded across her chest, her expression a storm of betrayal and sorrow. When he reached for her hand, she pulled away. After several tense minutes, she returned alone. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes red. "He says he'll change, that he was just nervous, that he only wanted to impress people. And do you believe him?" I asked softly. Her silence was answer enough. The rest of the evening dragged on. Guests departed earlier than planned, murmuring polite goodbyes. The reception had lost its sparkle. What remained was an unspoken understanding that the marriage had begun under a shadow far too heavy to ignore. That night, I drove Clara home. Ethan insisted on staying with friends, claiming he needed space to think. The irony was not lost on me. When we reached her apartment, Clara sank onto the couch, clutching the hem of her dress as if holding herself together. I sat beside her, silent. Sometimes silence is the only gift you can give. Finally, she spoke. "Dad, I think I made a mistake." I placed a hand over hers. "Mistakes are only permanent if you let them be. Let them be. What matters is what you do now." She leaned against me, her voice breaking. I wanted so badly to believe he was everything I dreamed of, but tonight, I saw who he really is. And I can't unsee it. I held her as she cried, my heart aching but also strangely relieved. She was beginning to see clearly. The following Monday, Walter called me. His voice was brisk, professional. "Porter, I thought you should know. Ethan's been suspended pending review. His arrogance has been noticed before, but Saturday confirmed what I'd feared. I can trust him in leadership if he can respect the very roots of the company." I sighed, not with satisfaction, but with inevitability. "He'll either learn humility or he won't," I said. "That's his choice." Walter paused. "I'll say this, Porter. UVA always had a way of letting the truth reveal itself without raising your voice. Saturday was unforgettable." We exchanged a few more words before hanging up. Later that evening, Clara visited me again. She looked different, calmer, though her face still carried the traces of sorrow. "I spoke to Ethan," she said. "He begged me to stand by him, promised he'd prove himself, that he'd change." She hesitated, then shook her head. But Dad, I realized something. He didn't apologize for how he hurt me. He only apologized for how he looked in front of others. Her voice steadied. And I can't live a life where appearances matter more than truth. I nodded slowly. Pride swelled in my chest, not because she had chosen my side, but because she had chosen wisdom. You've grown, Clara, I said quietly. Sometimes life teaches us the hardest lessons when we least expect them. But remember this, your worth is not tied to his pride. You are stronger than that. She smiled faintly through her tears. I get that now, and I think I need to step away from him, at least until he proves he can be the man he promised to be. I pulled her into an embrace. Whatever you decide, I'll be here. Always. As the weeks passed, the dust settled. Word spread quickly through Stratocore Ethan's suspension turned into a demotion. His star, once so bright, had dimmed almost overnight. Clara, meanwhile, poured herself into her own career, rediscovering the independence she had nearly sacrificed for Ethan's image of success. And me. I returned to my quiet life, my modest home, my bookshelf of memories. I had never needed recognition, never needed applause. All I had ever wanted was for my daughter to live a life rooted in love, respect, and truth. On a quiet evening not long after, Clara sat with me in the living room, sipping tea. She glanced at the old photographs on the shelf and smiled wistfully. You know, she said, Ethan always called this house small, but I think it's bigger than any mansion he could ever dream of, because it's full of the things that matter. I smiled, feeling the warmth of her words. Exactly, sweetheart. A man can live in a palace and still have nothing, or he can live in a cottage and have everything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I knew that though Ethan's arrogance had cast a long shadow, it had also revealed the strength of something far greater, the unshakable bond between a father and his daughter. And that, in the end, was all the legacy I needed. The weeks turned into months, and with them came clarity. At first, Clara tried to give Ethan the benefit of the doubt. She met with him for coffee, listened to his promises, and watched as he tried to piece together what little remained of his pride. But each conversation followed the same pattern. Excuses, self-pity, and desperate assurances that he could change. If only people would give him one more chance. It wasn't change he was chasing. It was control. One evening, Clara came to my home with a folder tucked under her arm. Her face was calm, her shoulders squared. I knew that look. It was the same one her mother had worn when she made difficult decisions with grace. Dad, she said, setting the folder on the table, I've spoken to an attorney. I'm filing for annulment. I studied her face, searching for hesitation. There was none, only resolve. You're certain? I asked. She nodded. Ethan doesn't see what he did wrong. He only sees what he lost. He's not mourning our relationship, Dad. He's mourning his reputation. And I won't spend my life being second to his image. My chest swelled with both sorrow and pride. Sorrow for the pain she had endured, but pride that she had chosen dignity over illusion. You're stronger than you know, Clara, I told her. Your mother would be proud. Tears welled in her eyes. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I couldn't have seen the truth without you. You've always been my anchor. News of the annulment spread quickly through Ethan's professional circles. Some whispered in pity, others in scorn. But the consensus was clear. Ethan had risen on borrowed arrogance. And when the truth came, he had nothing to stand on. At Stratocore, Walter's patience finally wore thin. Ethan's demotion became termination. Porter, Walter said when he called me one afternoon. I tried to give him a chance, but his ego wouldn't allow it. He blamed everyone but himself. He'll land somewhere else, I'm sure, but it won't be here. I simply replied, he needed humility more than a paycheck. Perhaps now he'll find it. Walter sighed. Perhaps, but we both knew, some men learn and some men don't. Clara, meanwhile, flourished. Free from Ethan's shadow, she threw herself into her work, earning recognition on her own merits. She spent weekends with me, bringing laughter back into my quiet home, reminding me that love endures even when dreams fall apart. One Saturday afternoon, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Clara turned to me with a thoughtful look. Dad, do you ever regret not telling me sooner? About Stratocore, about everything? I shook my head. No, if I had told you, you might have doubted your own judgment. You needed to see Ethan clearly on your own. My legacy was never meant to be a shield for you, Clara. It was meant to be a lesson. That respect matters more than wealth. That truth will always surface. That love can only survive when it's rooted in humility. She smiled faintly. I think I finally understand. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip low in the sky. Months later, I attended another wedding. Not Clara's, not yet, but a close friend of hers. As I stood in the back, watching two young people pledge their lives to one another, I thought of the road my daughter had walked. Painful, yes, but it had given her eyes to see what truly mattered. As the music swelled, I touched the cufflinks at my wrists, the same Stratocore emblems I had worn on Clara's wedding day. They no longer felt like symbols of unfinished battles. They felt like reminders of lessons learned, of pride dismantled, of truth revealed. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't vengeful, I was simply grateful. Grateful that my daughter had the strength to walk away. Grateful that arrogance had been unmasked before it could destroy her future. Grateful that in the end, the bond between us, father and daughter, had proven stronger than the illusions of status and pride. When Clara eventually finds someone else, someone who loves her for who she is, and not for the image she provides, she will walk down the aisle again. And this time, her partner will stand beside her with humility, not arrogance. And I will be there, as always, quiet, steadfast, proud, because in the end, the truest legacy a father can leave his child is not wealth, or status, or titles. It is the wisdom to see clearly, and that wisdom had finally taken root. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of memory. 2 years passed after Clara's annulment. At first, she carried herself with the quiet determination of someone piecing her life back together. There were nights when I heard her voice crack over the phone, nights when she sat on my porch with a mug of tea and eyes that seemed far older than her years. But gradually, the heaviness lifted. The shadows of Ethan's arrogance faded into the background of her story, no longer defining it. Clara began to thrive in ways I hadn't seen before. She poured herself into her work, earning recognition not through charm or connections, but through undeniable talent. Her colleagues respected her. Her supervisors valued her. She was no longer the girl caught in Ethan's shadow. She was Clara, the woman who stood on her own merit. One evening, as she sat across from me at the kitchen table, she smiled with a glow I hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she said, "I got promoted today. I'll be leading my own team." I grinned. "Congratulations, sweetheart. You earned it." She shook her head with a playful laugh. "Do you realize you've said that to me every time something good has happened? You earned it, because it's always true." I said, "Everything you've built honestly. That's something no one can take away from you." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw her mother, in her, the same quiet strength, the same dignity. Meanwhile, Ethan became little more than a distant rumor. A colleague mentioned once that he had tried to start a consulting business, but it failed within a year. Another said he had taken a sales job at a smaller firm, far from the prestige he once flaunted. I didn't dwell on him. Life has a way of humbling those who refuse to humble themselves, and while I never wished Ethan destruction, I knew his downfall had been inevitable. You cannot build a life on arrogance. And Clara no longer asked about him. She had moved on, her heart no longer tethered to his memory. One spring afternoon, Clara brought someone new to the house. His name was Daniel. He didn't wear a tailored suit or speak with rehearsed confidence. Instead, he arrived in a simple button-down shirt, carrying a bouquet of tulips, Clara's favorite. When he shook my hand, he looked me directly in the eye. There was no appraisal, no judgment, no attempt to measure me against his ambitions, just sincerity. "Mr. Wood," he said, "I've heard a lot about you. Clara says you make the best tea in the world. I'm hoping I'll get to try it today." I chuckled. "You're welcome here anytime. The kettle's already on." That evening was different from the 1 year ago when Ethan first entered my home. There was no condescension, no hidden insults, no performance, just conversation, laughter, and a gentle respect that filled the room. Later, as Clara helped Daniel carry dishes to the sink, I caught the way he looked at her, not as a trophy, not as a reflection of himself, but as someone he truly cherished. For the first time in years, I felt peace about her future. Months later, Clara stood before me again, her eyes shimmering with both excitement and nervousness. "Dad," she said, "Daniel asked me to marry him." I smiled, "And what did you say?" She laughed, a joyful sound that carried through the house. I said yes, of course. Tears welled in my eyes as I pulled her into a hug. "You chose well this time, Clara. I can see it in your smile." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "I think I finally learned what you've been trying to teach me all along. Love isn't about appearances or status. It's about respect, but about character." I kissed the top of her head. "Exactly. And you've earned that kind of love." The day of Clara's second wedding arrived under a sky painted with soft blues and golden light. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, no arrogance, no hidden truths waiting to erupt. As I walked her down the aisle, she held my arm with steady confidence. When the officiant asked who gave this woman in marriage, I spoke the same words as before, but this time, my heart carried only joy. "I do," I said, "her father, with love and hope for her happiness." Daniel looked at her with eyes full of devotion, and I knew. This was no illusion. This was real. That evening, as the reception filled with music and laughter, I stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet. The cufflinks I wore, the old Stratacore emblems, glinted softly in the moonlight. They had once been symbols of a hidden truth, weapons of quiet justice. But tonight, they were simply reminders of a journey completed. Clara joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "Dad," she whispered, "thank you for everything. For protecting me, for teaching me, for letting me find my own way." I squeezed her hand. "You did the hardest part yourself, Clara. You found your strength. That's all a father could hope for. We stood there together, watching the stars shimmer above us, the sounds of joy drifting from the hall behind us. In that moment, I knew. The story had come full circle. Ethan had been a chapter. Painful, necessary, unforgettable. But Daniel was a new beginning, and Clara's life, once shadowed by arrogance, now blossomed with humility, respect, and love. And as her father, I could finally rest in the knowledge that justice, though delayed, had been served, and replaced by something far greater. Not revenge, not triumph, but peace. Years after Clara's second wedding, life found its rhythm again. The seasons turned, grandchildren's laughter eventually filled the halls, and the past felt like a distant echo, though one never truly forgotten. I often sat on the porch in the evenings, the same porch where Clara once cried softly after her first marriage collapsed, the same porch where I had held my silence while Ethan boasted of futures he could never truly build. From that wooden swing, I watched time pass, and I thought about the way truth always finds its way into the light. Because that was the real lesson, not the wedding spectacle, not Ethan's humiliation, not even Daniel's quiet victory. It was the reminder that character is revealed slowly, steadily, and without fanfare. You can hide behind charm, you can puff your chest with arrogance, you can even dress your pride in tailored suits. But eventually, the world will see you for what you truly are. And when that day comes, you either stand tall, or you crumble. Ethan crumbled. But Clara, my Clara, stood tall. One afternoon, years later, Clara sat with me in the garden as her children played nearby. She asked, almost out of the blue, "Dad, do you ever regret not saying more back then? When Ethan insulted you, when he called you small?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her little ones chase fireflies across the grass. "No," I said after a moment, "because words can win battles, but truth wins wars." If I had shouted that day, if I had listed my accomplishments or thrown my past in his face, I would have looked no better than him. Silence gave him room to reveal his true self. She nodded slowly, her eyes tracing the horizon. "You were patient. I don't know if I could have been. That's why I'm the father, and you were still the daughter then," I said gently. "And now, you're the mother. You'll teach your children the same lesson, in your own way." She smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I think I already have." There were moments, late at night, when I wondered what became of Ethan. Not out of bitterness, no, that had long left me, but out of curiosity. Did he ever learn? Did life ever soften the jagged edges of his pride? Or did he remain trapped in the same cycle, chasing respect without earning it? I never sought the answer. Some doors are better left closed. My story with him ended the day Clara walked away from that courthouse, free and unburdened. The rest of his life belonged to him alone. What mattered was the family before me now. One built not on appearances, but on respect, humility, and love. On my last birthday, Clara surprised me with a framed photograph. It was taken at her second wedding. Me, in my simple suit, walking her down the aisle with a proud smile. The engraving at the bottom read, "Not measured by status, but by strength." I traced the words with my fingers, my throat tightening. Clara had understood the lesson all along, and now, she was passing it forward. Legacy isn't about wealth, or titles, or companies founded. Those things fade. Even strata core, the empire Ethan once worshipped, had changed hands, shifted leadership, reinvented itself beyond recognition. My fingerprints on it were invisible to the new generation, but that was fine. Because my true legacy wasn't in boardrooms or profit margins. It was in Clara. It was in the way she carried herself with dignity. It was in the way she taught her children to say please and thank you. It was in the way she chose a partner, not for the shine of his shoes, but for the kindness in his heart. That was my legacy, and no one could ever take that away. Sometimes, when the house grew quiet and the garden was still, I thought back to the moment Ethan had first looked at me with those condescending eyes. Just retired, he had said. Living small, he thought he had stripped me of my worth with a few careless words. But in truth, he had only revealed his own emptiness. And when the truth finally rose to the surface, at the wedding, before the boss he idolized, the entire room had seen what I already knew. That status is a fragile shield, and that arrogance is the surest path to downfall. The real power lies in patience, in silence, in knowing who you are without needing to shout it. That was the lesson I left for Clara. That was the lesson I hope my grandchildren will one day understand. Because in the end, life is not about proving yourself to others. It's about living in such a way that, when the truth is revealed, it speaks louder than anything you could have ever said. And so, as the sun dipped low beyond the horizon, I sat with peace in my heart. Not because I had won. Not because Ethan had lost. But because Clara had grown, healed, and chosen a life built on respect. And for a father, that was victory enough. Ethan was loud. Ethan was polished. Ethan wanted the world to believe he was unstoppable. But when the truth came, when silence spoke louder than his words, he fell apart. And I didn't need to raise my voice, or remind anyone who I was, or recount my past. All I had to do was stand still. Because real strength doesn't demand recognition, it simply exists, unshakable, undeniable. Now, years later, I find myself looking back at it all, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with clarity. That wedding, that single moment when Ethan introduced me to his boss as an old loser, became a turning point in more lives than one. For me, it was the moment I remembered that silence has its own power. For Clara, it was the moment she began to see the cracks in the man she thought she loved. For Ethan, it was the moment his illusions shattered under the weight of reality. Sometimes, life doesn't need us to fight battles with fists or words. Sometimes, all it takes is patience. The willingness to let arrogance collapse on its own. I've seen many things in my lifetime. I've walked through the rise and fall of businesses. I've known both prosperity and grief. I've lost people I loved deeply, and I've watched others leave by choice. Through it all, one truth has remained. Character outlasts circumstance. Ethan thought wealth, titles, and connections were enough to carry him. But character is what survives when everything else falls away. And in the end, he had none. That was why his empire crumbled. That was why Clara walked away. That was why he became a story people whispered about instead of a man they respected. One evening, not long ago, my grandson, barely 12, asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Grandpa," he said, "what does it mean to be strong?" I thought of Ethan. I thought of the wedding. I thought of the cufflinks that once felt like weapons, but later became reminders of something greater. And I answered him simply, being strong doesn't mean being the loudest, or the richest, or the one people fear. Being strong means knowing who you are, and holding on to it even when others try to make you feel small. He nodded, as if tucking the lesson away. And in that moment, I realized the story wasn't just Clara's, it wasn't just mine. It was theirs now too, my grandchildren, the next generation who would walk into a world full of people like Ethan, and I prayed they would remember. Silence can be strength, and dignity is never wasted. Clara still asks me sometimes if I regret not exposing Ethan sooner. She wonders if her heartbreak could have been avoided, but I always tell her the same thing. Sweetheart, every lesson comes with a price. Yours was painful, yes, but it gave you eyes to see truth. It gave you wisdom you carry now into your marriage with Daniel, into the way you raise your children. That wisdom came because you walked through the fire. She always smiles softly, understanding, and I know she carries no bitterness now, only gratitude that her past shaped her present. As for me, I've made peace with it all. The man Ethan once tried to belittle, the so-called old loser, still wakes up every morning, pours a cup of tea, and sits on the porch watching the world spin on. I'm not chasing recognition. I'm not clinging to titles. I'm not trying to prove myself anymore. I don't need to, because the people who matter already know who I am. Clara knows, Daniel knows, my grandchildren know, and that's enough. In the end, the only legacy worth leaving behind is not in companies or wealth. It's in the love and lessons we pass on. Sometimes, I imagine that night at the wedding, as if it were frozen in time. Ethan's smug grin, Clara's nervous smile, the boss's eyes widening as he recognized me, the room falling into silence as the truth unfolded without a word. It's almost poetic now. A single moment, simple yet profound, where arrogance met reality, and reality won. That image will never leave me, not because it was a victory, but because it was a reminder. We don't have to force truth into the light. It will find its way there on its own. So, as I sit here, older now, watching the sun set over the same home Ethan once dismissed as small, I can say this with certainty. I was never small, I was never a loser, and I never needed to prove otherwise. Because dignity isn't about what others call you. It's about who you are when no one's watching, and what remains when the noise fades. That's the lesson I leave behind. Not just for Clara, not just for my grandchildren, but for anyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. You don't need to shout to be seen. You don't need to fight to be heard. Just stand firm, because one day, the truth will speak for you, and it will be louder than anything arrogance could ever say. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure you resubscribed and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss our next dramatic story. And now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in this father-esque place? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.